my name's Ian and I am a long-term gamer, having played many different role-playing, war and board games over the years. I have my own campaign world that has been going for about 40 years, which has been explored by adventurers using Dungeons & Dragons, RuneQuest and Rollmaster rules, and of various editions. I am also very fond of the Traveller and Call of Cthulhu games, and eventually I may get to do a top of however many of rules systems. Someone suggested that I should go down the dark alley of doing a few top videos, so here's the first. Remember, my top is not necessarily going to be your top, so getting upset that I've said something that you particularly love lower down on the scale, or even not at all, is wasted energy. You're welcome to disagree, but in all things subjective, I am not wrong, and neither are you. And for the first of these, I give you my top 30 published adventures for Dungeons & Dragons. This video deals with 10 through to 1, with some honourable mentions. Please see the links for the first part, covering 30 through to 11. And when I say published adventures, I do not specifically mean adventures or modules published by TSR or Wizards of the Coast, although most of them are. I have drawn this list from all adventures that I've enjoyed over the years, official modules, adventures published in magazines, licensed works, and so on. The only criteria here is that the adventure is considered to have seen print and have been reasonably distributed. I've also considered linked series of works as single adventures. For example, where 2 or more modules collectively describe a single adventure, I've given them a single entry. I'm not going to go into these adventures in any great detail, and certainly going to avoid major spoilers. And so without further rambling, the Lendor Isles campaign, like the Adlerweg campaign set up by the Sentinel in the Gauntlet, presents a small area in some detail. This time, instead of a solid story to the piece, it is set out more in a sandbox manner, with several locations in and around a central town described, and a rumour chart to pique the player's interest in each. Things get a little tighter in the story front, with the Assassin's Knot, which focuses more on plot elements than its companion. I find this adventure works best if the DM inserts the player characters as residents of the town of Restonford, the focal point of L1, and provides surface background to them regarding the town and its inhabitants. Giving the characters contacts within the town and a different set for each character works really well and makes them feel part of the setting rather than just visitors. Doing this sets them up for the events of L2 and provides impetus for them to engage in the events described therein. The 2 adventures also do not have to be run sequentially. There is a lot to explore in L1, and you can shake things up a bit by starting the events of L2 before the players have fully explored L1. The campaign setting is further revisited in the Silver Anniversary Collector set with the inclusion of L3, Deep Dwarven Delve, touted as the last official 1st edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons module, and in materials by the series author Len Lakofka, available from dragonsfoot.org, the Lendor Isle Companion, and modules L4, Devil Spawn, and L5, covering the Croton campaign. One of the oddities of TSR was their lateness into the module publishing game, and when they did finally start, they threw straight in at the intermediate levels of play. It wasn't until 1979, with the publication of the first 2 adventures in the B series and the original module T1, The Village of Hommlet, that they finally got some solid low-level scenarios out of the door. Unlike the B series, The Village of Hommlet is not wholly a beginner's adventure. It doesn't do much in the way of hand-holding, and the adventure can be quite challenging. It also states boldly that it is part of a larger work, noting the imminent publication of T2, The Temple of Elemental Evil, and we all looked forward to that. 6 years later, instead of a T2, TSR went straight for a combination module in the form of T1-4, The Temple of Elemental Evil. For various reasons, the module writing was delayed, and ultimately ended up as being a combined work of luminaries Gary Gygax and Frank Mentzer. The T2, or T2-4 material, is a dungeon crawl, but with a definite intent. More than a collection of rooms to plunder, the eponymous temple is a living, breathing hotbed of factions and intrigue that adds depth and purpose to the characters' interactions with it. Published in 1985, the Temple of Elemental Evil formed a start of a grand campaign that consisted largely of compiled and reformatted modules from the late 1970s and early 1980s. With this and the other 3 compilation volumes, A1-4 Scourge of the Slave Lords, GDQ 1-7 Queen of the Spiders, and S1-4 Realms of Horror, a marvellous ongoing campaign could be built. The Temple has also received further attention. In 2003, a computer game was released that largely covered the events of T1-4, which, although buggy in its original form, remains one of the most fun Dungeons & Dragons computer games. Return to the Temple of Elemental Evil was published for the 3rd edition in 2001, continuing the tradition of revisits or return tos that Wizards of the Coast were following at the time. But this is, in my opinion, a convoluted mess of a railroad, and is best kept away from its antecedents' legacy. Finally, Goodman Games have the Temple of Elemental Evil on their list of Original Adventures Reincarnated books, and it is due to be released, as far as the information available at the time of this recording, in August of 2021. I do think that there is a tangible difference between what is perceived as fantasy on different sides of the Great Pond of the Atlantic. Off-the-cuff speculation puts a guess at differences in how we are introduced to fantasy, specifically on the medieval-esque era that is the default for Dungeons & Dragons. We in the UK grow up virtually surrounded by castle ruins and ancient mounds, dating back hundreds if not thousands of years, and are introduced to a very long history that we can tangibly see, if not touch, the artifacts from an earlier age. For Americans, the introduction usually comes through the works of fiction and movies, and their perception of fantasy differs accordingly. Now, I'm not saying that either baseline is a good or a bad thing, just that it is different. Within the expanse of role-playing, this can be sampled by comparing those adventures originating from TSR UK and those produced by its parent company in the USA. Most obviously, these are represented by the U and the UK series, but there are other examples in the TSR canon where British authors have shown their colours, so to speak. The U series revolves around the town of Saltmarsh, which is left to the DM to design within a few guidelines. As with the Lendor series, this gives the DM the opportunity to cast the player characters as either outsiders who have just arrived in town, or residents, or indeed a mix of the two. The mini-campaign begins with the player characters investigating a haunted house, from which point layers are gradually revealed, until ultimately they must face the final enemy. The main reason why I like this series is that it is actually a set of easy-to-run, interesting dungeons glued together with a good overarching plot, which has overtones of Moonfleet and Cornish smuggling operations of the 18th century. The dungeons are challenging for their level, and each possesses its own unique features, so it never feels like more of the same. The fact that one of the dungeons is, depending on what the characters end up doing, a diplomatic mission adds more to the whole campaign arc than the traditional go here, kill that scope. Play this series with atmosphere and colour, and you will find a heady mix of swashbuckling and nautical horror therein. The U series forms the basis for the recent 5th edition adventure Ghosts of Saltmarsh by Wizards of the Coast. This version dials up the horror elements and expands on Saltmarsh and the surrounding areas, obviously taking away the encouragement for the DM to make Saltmarsh their own from the original. As with most of the D&D adventure offerings from Wizards, it is a bit of a railroad, but it is amongst the best of the official line of 5th edition adventures. This may be a controversial one, but I'll dive in. Once upon a time, there was a thing in the UK called the Dungeons & Dragons Players Association. I believe it existed from around 1981 through to 84, but don't quote me on that. Regardless, it was a sort of UK iteration of the RPGA, although many of us that were members of the Players Association were also members of the RPGA. Ultimately, the Players Association merged into the RPGA as a whole, becoming the foundations for the UK and European branches of it. One of the benefits of membership was access to official tournament modules. These came in as the R and RPGA series. Among my favourites of these were the first 4 in the R series: R1, To the Aid of Falx; R2, The Investigation of Hydell; R3, The Egg of the Phoenix; and R4, Docks Island. R4 formed a sequel to R3, and all 4 were written by the D&D luminary Frank Mentzer. What appealed to me was that they were all concise dungeons with logical reasons to exist, with ecologies that made sense, and each had a unique twist to it. You're helping a dragon against a thieves' guild with monstrous allies in the first, uncovering the mystery behind a hitherto unknown slave species in the second. The third deals with the recovery of an artifact. In the fourth, the characters take that artifact to a powerful benefactor for safekeeping and then help him clear out the lower levels of the dungeon beneath his island. At this point, it is worth noting that the first 2 have nothing to do with the second 2. Now we arrive in the mid-1980s, and at that time, TSR was going through a consolidation and compilation period, with works such as I3-5, The Desert of Desolation, I1-4, Scourge of the Slave Lords, and GDQ 1-7, Queen of the Spiders, all earlier modules now repackaged and reformatted into single-volume campaigns. As part of this, General Jacquet, at the time Paul Jacquet, a renowned artist and role-playing author responsible for such famous works as Dark Tower and Caverns of Thracia, was tasked with compiling the R series. Now, from what I understand of the history, it goes something like this. General's intended task was to compile the R modules into a single volume, such as was being done to the S series in S1-4 Realms of Horror. Somewhere along the line, this got misinterpreted into taking the R series as a whole and structuring it into a single campaign narrative. So, with the publication of I-12, Egg of the Phoenix, that is what we got. Some argue that in this it makes no sense. I'd argue back by pointing out that the plot holes in the vaunted GDQ series with the statement that I-12 makes as much sense, if not more, than that particular work. General added linking sections and whole new areas to weave the core of each of the original modules into a whole. She changed the order so that the party go through the scenario as outlined originally in R2 first, then R1, and then finish up with R3 and R4. Recurring villains were added, some reappearing in unexpected form. A world populated by undead and devils, with a skull-shaped moon possessing a highly destructive gaze, was added. An epic, world-shattering conclusion brought the whole thing to a close. The campaign thus morphed a collection of compact tournament dungeons into one of the craziest swords and sorcery module plots that TSR ever pushed out. Quite simply, the R series was good. Collected with General's Edition, I-12 is utterly fantastic. The one thing that makes this adventure so worthwhile having in your collection is adaptability. The campaign setting, introduced first in R3 and R4, and then expanded on in I-12, is pretty generic and unadulterated D&D one. This means that there are no strange races or weird specifics that need to be resolved if you are going to use this in any other setting. You can drop the locations of the campaign into relative equivalence for the setting that you are using, and apply any of the strangeness that your setting of choice uses, and then off you go. Some say this is one of the worst D&D modules, but I firmly believe that it is one of the best. Well, no surprises that this turns up in the top 10, but let me tell you this about the secret of old modules. They're good because we, as DMs of a certain vintage, made most of it up ourselves. A comment on one of my recent videos sums this up by noting that most new D&D adventures resemble stories with adventures, while most old modules are adventures that become stories, and I think this is very true. Now we have hundreds of pages in a single adventure, devoted to explain and detail every non-player character, every room, every plot point. In the oldie days, we had a booklet of 16, 32 or sometimes 64 pages. Many adventures, like some that we have mentioned in this top 30, left gaps, giving the DM a few paragraphs upon which to build his own version of whatever is needed. This is true of Saltmarsh in the U series, of Averoin in Castle Amber, of the lower sections of the Lost City, and of Huel in the Desert Nomad's duology. Where modules formed a series, there were often gaps between each, especially as quite often these modules were originally designed to be relatively self-contained tournament rounds. This is true of the A series, and this is true of the 7 modules that form this epic campaign. Beginning with G1 Steading of the Hill Giant Chief, Gary Gygax wrote the bulk of this material of these adventures during the period in which he was compiling the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide for 1st edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Indeed, new monsters introduced in these modules appear in the encounter tables and statistic summaries in the Dungeon Master's Guide. This is no mean feat, but it was achieved, and with the addition of G2 Glacial Rift of the Frost Giant Jarl, G3 Hall of the Fire Giant King, D1 Descent into the Depths of the Earth, D2 Shrine of the Kuo-Toa, and D3 Vault of the Drow, an impressive series of connected adventures was formed. Dave C. Sutherland was drafted in to place a capstone on it with Q1 Queen of the Demonweb Pits, which arrived in 1980. Prior to D1, the adventure is a series of more or less standard fare dungeons, but at a giant scale. The opportunities for players to think their way through them is rife, especially when travelling from one to the next as part of the campaign. But they feel very much like skirmish war games on the whole. Things really get going with D1. Mega dungeons be damned. You cannot beat a dungeon that runs for literally miles. What's more, that whole concept of encouraged DMs to make stuff up was present and proud here, with the inclusion of a virtually blank map of the Underdark setting. Did we fill the rest of it in? Of course. The D modules themselves were a sequence of site-based scenarios, with extensive encounter tables. You can have some fun generating and giving meaning to encounters ahead of play, rather than rolling them ad hoc during play. Scope for DM expansion of D3 is great, especially in that very blank area of the main map that represents a city. Queen of the Demonweb Pits is a challenge to play and DM in itself. It boils down to more site-based scenarios, but the connective tissue in the form of an eponymous Demonweb is there to confuse. Additionally, extra-dimensional doors are scattered all over the place, allowing DMs to insert their own favourite adventures as side quests. There's even a land ruled over by a vampire from a brooding castle behind one of them. There is a problem with the whole series, though. That is, it's inconsistent. At the start, giants are attacking settlements. The player characters find out who is urging the giants to do this, eventually penetrating those perpetrators home. And then, for no apparent reason, the characters go after the goddess that rules over an opposing faction to the one causing all of the mischief in the first place. In fact, Q1 appears to be tacked on to the series as a "this is where you end up if you" sort of affair, along similar veins to Dungeonland's connection to Greyhawk Ruins, for example, rather than a true closure to the overall plot. When the module was combined in GDQ 1-7, Queen of the Spiders, this element was resolved by making the whole thing make sense. Sort of. In the most extensive run-through of the series that I did, we made sense of Q1 in this way. The characters actually joined the Drow in bringing down the rebel faction that was causing all of the fuss with the giants. Following that conflict, and true to the chaotic nature of Drow, the characters are then promptly captured for helping destroy a noble house. Their punishment? To be sacrificed to the Demon Queen by casting them, disarmed, through the portal into the Demonweb, taking a few cues from In the Dungeons of the Slave Lords in this regard. Surviving, without gear, in the abyss. Cruel? Perhaps, but it made for an enjoyable challenge, and they made good use of those extra-dimensional portal doors to rearm and prepare for assaulting the Demonweb properly in a quest to return home. And it is this sort of thing that makes these old adventures great. Not that they provided everything on a plate for us to follow, but they presented the minimal skeleton of a plot that with further development by a DM can be turned into something that suits that DM and his group of players far better than any extensively detailed couple of hundred of pages of an adventure can. Ultimately, this leads to these older adventures often rating higher in polls than most of their modern counterparts. And it's largely because not all players taking part in such polls are remembering precisely the same adventure, regardless of the identical titles on the cover of the modules that their DM pulled the material from. I don't think I need to say much about this one, since I've covered it fairly extensively, and my own thoughts on it in review of Goodman's game Original Adventures Reincarnated Volume 5. In summary, I love weird fiction, I love pulp fantasy, Clark Ashton Smith is one of my favourite authors of that genre, Castle Amber is inspired by his short stories on the fantasy medieval realm of Averoin. It's a great module. Another one of the few that I've both played and DM'd, and my original copy of it has been used so many times I've had to retire it in favour of a drive-through RPG print-on-demand copy and Goodman Games Reincarnation. I love this to bits, literally. Tracy Hickman perhaps has more fame these days as one of the co-authors of the series of Dragonlance novels, and quite rightly so. But he is also a talented module writer, and many of these he wrote with his wife Laura. Given that a few of Tracy and Laura's adventures turn up on my top 30, you could say I'm somewhat of a fan. Ravenloft is perhaps the one module that they are most famous for, but it is far from being their best in my opinion. Its precursors in the I-series of modules, I3 Pharaoh, I4 Desert of Desolation, and I5 Lost Temple of Martek, are collectively superior in both scope, plot, and treatment of their location. Perhaps Ravenloft resembles the cheesy Hammer horror movies that were already old when I was young, or maybe there is one too many bad puns carved into the tombs beneath that castle. Whatever the reason, the three modules of the Desert of Desolation carry more inspiration for me than Strahd's House ever did. The modules are essentially a collection of mini-dungeons, each a variation on the broad theme of desert ruin. The whole work tells of genies warring upon each other, of a prophecy, and of the player character's part in bringing this to fruition. On the surface, the series appears to be somewhat of a railroad. This is true to some extent, but only insofar as the events foretold by the prophecy. What the characters end up doing to resolve the whole affair does not feel forced in this way. The modules guide, rather than force, the adventures through what must be done. The fact that the characters must handle the desert itself also serves to hand the plot initiative to them, at least as far as the players are aware, as they must work out the best way to keep themselves safe from its predations through magical or mundane means. As we've discussed for a lot of adventures of the 1980s, the series was collected as I3-5 Desert of Desolation in 1987. It was one of the earliest adventures released for the Forgotten Realms logo on it, as part of its compilation involved revision to make it fit into the realms. Even though the wilderness map was redrawn to suit its new home, the adventure lost none of its character in a translation. In fact, it works equally well, whether playing the original modules in their generic setting, or within the Forgotten Realms framework of the compilation, or of course adapting it to another setting with an appropriate desert. It is my favourite of the mid-1980s compilations, and collectively the three modules stand out among that very strong list represented by the I-series in general. Did I mention I was a bit of a Tracy and Laura Hickman fan? Well, here we are again. This time, bad things were happening in a temple near an elven village, and the player characters, being the heroes that they are, must go and investigate. Rahasia is unique amongst the Dungeons & Dragons modules in that it was revised and reprinted 4 times, originally by Daystar West Media Production, as had been the original version of Pharaoh, then as RPGA 1, Rahasia, and RPGA 2, Black Opal Eye, and then as Module B7, Rahasia for the basic Dungeons & Dragons game, and finally as part of the B1-9 In Search of Adventure compiled module. Personally, my favourite iteration is the 2-module RPGA edition from 1983, which was my first introduction to it. I think this is more of a personal commentary on the layout used for the modules in the mid-period of the BCMI rules. As a DM, I liked lots of space and sometimes found the 3-column layout a little cramped. The adventures are otherwise virtually the same, with Black Opal Eye forming the Adventure in Elias's Tower section of B7. Very broadly speaking, Rahasia is a dungeon crawl. What makes it unique is the way in which its 6+1 levels are connected. This makes the whole very non-linear, and quite often players discover locations that they need to visit to progress long before the discovering of the import of those locations or what they need to do there. More than once, a confused mapper of a party's progress has suddenly lit up at the table as the realization of how all of the partial chunks of dungeon that he's been sketching fit together. Other than the map, the plot itself is fairly straightforward, and players usually get the idea of what they are dealing with pretty quickly, leaving just the map to contend with. A lot of low-level adventures fail because they are bland, their authors believing that low-level must equal simplicity, and that is not the case. In fact, low-level adventures can often be more exciting than higher-level ones, as the players are limited in the tools their characters have at their fingers to resolve situations, not to mention that low-level characters tend to be more fragile and therefore their players more cautious. Rahasia wins out because it is simple enough to give new players to get into the game, and complex enough to keep veteran players on their toes. This was an adventure penned by the crew of TSR UK, Jim Bamborough, Graham Morris and Phil Gallagher. The concept was to bridge the basic and expert rule sets, with basic being mainly concerned with dungeons and levels 1 through 3, and expert introducing wilderness adventuring and covering levels 4 through 14. Night's Dark Terror spanned levels 2 through to 4, and included both dungeons and wilderness exploration components. The adventure gets going with a set-piece bang as the player characters rush into a skirmish and later help prepare, Seven Samurai-wise, the defences of a small Steading. Further discoveries lead to the characters into direct conflict with a sinister organisation, have them travelling literally all over the map, and ultimately mount an expedition to locate an ancient lost land. There is simply so much material within these pages that any group of players would be hard-pressed to make short work of it. One of the best things about it is that it rarely gets into railroading the characters. There are a few occasions, but these are more in line with a schedule of events for a particular encounter area. For example, the events of the aforementioned defence of the Steading. Other than that, the characters pick up clues and information from various locations, and then are left to decide what to do about it. There is no linear plot to follow. This is as near to a sandbox as any Dungeons & Dragons official adventure module ever reached. Of course, the Sinister organisation do drive things along a bit, with their operations against the player characters, but they are not the ultimate endgame of the adventure, and indeed, it is likely that they will cease to be of any further trouble once the characters head out for the journey to discovery that will lead them to even more fame, fortune, and danger. All in all, it's a brilliant transition adventure, bridging low level to the start of intermediate. There's a good mix of role-playing, puzzle-solving and monster slaying throughout, and I think a lot of current adventure authors could learn a great deal by breaking down Night's Dark Terror's structure. A great adventure that everyone should try at least once. Before we get to my number one favourite published D&D adventure, let's have some honourable mentions. I mean, it's traditional for these list things, right? With the introduction of the D&D companion set in 1984, the general sweep of the game went like this. Basic. Explore dungeons, beat up monsters, learn the game, level up. Expert. Travel the great outdoors, beat up monsters, have more complex adventures, level up. Companion. Find a nice area to settle down. Beat up the monsters that call it home. Build a castle. Gain more territory. Beat up opposing castles. Beat up monsters that beat on your settlers. Oh, and of course, level up. More things were to come with the Masters and Immortals sets, of course. The first module released for the companion rules, Test of the Warlords, puts into practice the domain establishing guidelines from the set. Here, a map is provided, impetus is given for the player characters to dive into exploring the map and clearing an area to establish a domain, and several events and encounters are provided to explore what it means to be a high-level character responsible for those that have chosen his domain as their home. These run from monster lairs to outright war. Future releases would explore similar concepts, the Birthright campaign setting, for example. But at this point in time, the concept was still relatively new. I say relatively new because its basic idea can be traced all the way back to wargaming campaigns from the 1960s. But to role-playing games, it was different. I have to admit, I love liches. Not in any carnal sense, but as primary foes. I despair when I see throwaway encounters in adventures that use them just as bog-standard monsters with spells. They are so much more. You're dealing with a high-powered wizard, which is already a character that will have a fair chunk of backstory to tell, that has, for whatever reason, turned to undeadhood, or has had undeadhood thrust upon them, doubly adding to the depth of the mind that should be their story. Heading all the way back to 1976, within the pages of Supplement 3 Eldritch Wizardry, we have the words, "The Hand," and it is also rumoured in dark passageways, an eye, is the sole remains of an ancient lich who was so powerful that he was able to imbue his hand with wondrous and horrible powers, and to enable it to survive even after his long undead body had ceased to exist. And so, one of Dungeons & Dragons' greatest antagonists was introduced into the game, or at least, for now, certain remnants of him. Over the years, the legends of Vecna were expanded upon, the culmination of which was Module WGA4, Vecna Lives. This was a tough, high-level adventure which begins with the player characters taking on the roles of the most famous wizards of the Greyhawk setting, before switching to their own or provided pre-generated characters. From there, it is an expansive and terrifying jaunt across the chunk of the Greyhawk setting and beyond. A few years later, a sequel of sorts came out, Vecna Reborn. Here it was revealed that Vecna had found himself trapped in the plain of Ravenloft following the events of Vecna Lives, and was trying to come to terms with his old arch-rival Cass as a neighbour. The characters are thrown into the middle of this and Vecna's attempts to break free of the Dread Mists. Finally, with the second edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons ending its run, the huge sprawl that was Die, Vecna, Die closed off the trilogy and the game. 2 adventures were published at this time as game-ending scenarios, the Apocalypse Stone and Die, Vecna, Die. Their purpose was to act as closure to the second edition line, in lieu of the forthcoming release of third edition. The fact that Vecna appears as a deity within the default setting of 3rd edition gives you some idea of the intended direction of this adventure, although that wasn't necessarily the case. So, from a few paragraphs of description regarding some remnant items imbued with magical power, to a world-ending epic, Vecna's passage through the first few editions of Dungeons & Dragons has been nothing short of swords and sorcery spectacular. Acererak be damned, Vecna is the lich for me. The Oriental Adventures modules, by and large, are excellent forays into a sort of mashed-together vision of the East, depicted by the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons expansion. As mentioned elsewhere in this countdown, I feel the first of these, Swords of the Daimyo, is the standout of all of them, but Blood of the Yakuza is another fantastic work. But just bubbling outside my top 30, though, is the campaign represented by OA6 Ronin Challenge and OA7 Test of the Samurai. It starts with a kumite, a martial arts competition, in which the player characters are competing, and it ends with a battle against an immortal. The 2 components of this campaign are not particularly well connected. They do not form a single overall narrative, and the change of location is jarring. But that aside, the plot lines and the encounters of each adventure are intriguing, and work well when the players immerse themselves into the setting. Like OA1, Swords of the Daimyo, the FRA series deals with a Stranger in a Strange Land crossover concept between East and West. These modules were released to support the Empires trilogy, Horse Lords, Dragonwall and Crusade, which describes the Mongol-like invasion of the Tugun against themselves, Karaturs Shulung, and an alliance of nations of the Forgotten Realms. This situation is also covered by the Horde campaign setting and FR12 Horde campaign battle system supplement. The FRA series uses the Tugun invasion as a backdrop, more than anything else. Occasionally the characters meet up with the invading horse nomads, But for the most part, they have other things to do than fight in wars. The adventure makes the assumption that the characters are of Western descent, and much of the payoff for many of the role-playing opportunities with it comes from the interaction between the player characters with cultures that they know nothing about, at least at first. Alongside this are adventure locations that have the characters coming into contact with even more culture shock. The analogues drawn up in the adventure come from Tibet, Nepal, Mongolia, China, Afghanistan, and more. Criticism was levelled at the time for this mashup, and some of that is perhaps warranted. This does not prevent the adventures as a whole from being unique and interesting and enjoyable. And now, my favourite, number one, greatest, most fantastic, whatever, what I think is the best published Dungeons & Dragons adventure. It is... Most of the adventures published in White Dwarf were short affairs, a few pages in a single issue. This made them ideal for one-session runs, side quests to main campaign threads, or one-shots for a bit of fun. A few were longer affairs, split over a couple of issues, presenting scenarios with a bit more depth and scope. One ended up spanning no less than 6 issues, and that was the monster known as Irillion, written by Daniel Colleton. To sum it up simply, Irillion describes the eponymous town in some detail and wove its background material into a companion adventure, The Rising of the Dark. But more on that in a bit. A full 13 issues beforehand, 2 series of articles by Paul Vernon appeared in the pages of the magazine that formed the foundation for at least part of Irillion's concept. Designing a Quasi-Medieval Society in White Dwarf issues 29 and 30, and The Town Planner from issues 31 through to 33. These articles dissected medieval society in comparison to details from the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons books, notably NPC wages and crafting times from the Dungeon Master's Guide. These articles also proposed a breakdown of wealth based on yearly income, what that income might be based on profession, and what influence individuals of differing wealth levels would have over the society. The Town Planner articles then describe the functions of towns, factors that would shape them in size and nature, and the gears and the cogs that would keep them ticking. In compiling Irillion, Colleton built on Vernon's outlines, creating statistics for shops, establishments and individuals to show their wealth, their yearly income and thus influence, what it would take to bribe them, how much things would cost there, factors greater than or less than the prices listed in the player's handbook, the nature and condition of buildings, and in some ways this did for the hundreds of described buildings of the town what Traveller did for star systems, presenting the Dungeon Master with a lot of pertinent information in one easy-to-understand data hit. The Irillion articles also covered the culture, religion, organisation and languages of the town, so the thing isn't just a massive list of shop data, although a large chunk of it is. None of this background feels nailed on. It all meshes perfectly within the setting as a whole. The really clever thing about it is the way that the source material is introduced. The accompanying adventure, The Rising of the Dark, is not just an adventure set mostly in the city, but it's a tour of the city itself. Each part of the adventure leads the players to another part of town. From an instalment perspective, this was a scenario produced for a magazine after all. This made perfect sense. But it also made sense insofar as walking a prospective DM for the piece around the city in a manageable portion, enabling him to really make it live. Over the years, I've used Irillion, occasionally under different names, for all sorts of purposes, including its original presentation and scenario. It had served as a solid template for my own city and town creations, too, along with another favourite supplement of mine, which I may get to if I do a top role-playing game books video. It stood as a Saltmarsh in one playthrough of the U series. It has been destroyed, rebuilt, recast, expanded, contracted and otherwise manipulated so many times. Not just for Dungeons & Dragons either. Irillion and the articles it drew upon are so easily adapted to any fantasy medieval role-playing system. Some adventures are good because they are fun. Some are good because they present something different, not just a new monster or magic item or whatever, but something memorable within their entire structure. Some are good because of what they can do for players, challenging experienced players or bringing new players into the fold. Some, like Aurelian, are good because they remain relevant and useful well beyond the original scope and boundaries. And that is why Aurelian tops my top 30 published Dungeons & Dragons adventures. So I hope you've enjoyed this rundown. I may do other top videos in the future, but next in the pipeline is the history and review of one of my all-time favourite games, Call of Cthulhu. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to do all of that like, share, subscribe stuff, and share your own lists of your personal top D&D adventures in the comments, especially your reasons and why you list what you list.